Let's get together, folks, to have our next session. If those of you in the lobby would come in and find your seats. We're going to continue with C.S. Lewis. Dr. Michael Peterson is professor of philosophy at Asbury University. I noticed that a number of students from across the street are here this afternoon. We're very glad that you've come to join us. We welcome you, and we've appreciated you sharing your professors with us in this conference. They've added much to what we're doing. Mike Peterson and I have worked together on this project now for 2 years. It was 2 years ago this month when Dr. Callis asked us with Larry Wood to consider submitting a grant proposal to the Templeton Foundation. We would not be here and we would not have the collection of speakers and this program without his expertise, his continual advice. He's served as a guide and a consultant in this process. He's been immensely helpful, and I am deeply grateful for what he has done in helping to make all of this possible, and even more as we look forward to next year and the following year. He's written and he's taught for many years in philosophy of science, written extensively in the field. He's the editor of the journal Faith and Philosophy. He has been a recipient of grants from Templeton and the Lilly Foundation, and is a person who is just well known in the field and has much to offer. What he's going to do now is going to open up what you just saw in demonstration about Lewis, to go and dig out some of what was referred to as those deeper truths that can be shared and can be taught and can help us understand more clearly these things that we're talking about in relation to faith and science. So, Mike, please come and lead us.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be with you. I have to admit, this is my first PowerPoint presentation. Give me a whiteboard and a nice marker pen and I'm good. But we felt like we needed to do these media presentations, and this was going to initiate me. In religious terms, it's a baptism, maybe a condemnation. I don't know. We'll know at the end. But following Greg and Devin and the rich multimedia that they have given us, you're going to see a little more text from me. I don't have quite their expertise. And so I'll be getting used to this. Maybe I'll kind of get in rhythm here as we go. But I wanted to begin by reading from 1 Peter 3:15. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give a reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. And probably no other Christian writer in modern times fulfills this admonition better than C.S. Lewis. So whether we call what he was engaged in intellectual evangelism or natural theology or pre-evangelism or apologetics, I'm not so interested in the term, but I'm interested in how he took orthodox, historical, classical Christianity, Nicene Christianity, mere Christianity as he called it, into full engagement with the ideas in his culture. So that's what I'm interested in this presentation, particularly with respect to science. Of course, nobody says it better than Lewis does in his own words. Let me read that for you. This is from Learning in Wartime. If all the world were Christian, it might not matter if all the world were uneducated. But as it is, a cultural life will exist outside the church, whether it exists inside it or not. To be ignorant and simple now, not to be able to meet the enemies on their own ground, would be to throw down our weapons and to have no defense against intellectual attacks on the other side. Good philosophy must exist if for no other reason than because bad philosophy needs to be answered. The cool intellect must work against cool intellect on the other side. And most of all, perhaps, we need an intimate knowledge of the past. And he goes on and continues that thought about engaging culture because it exists outside the church. And the knowledge of the past, in a sense, refers to where did we come from? Not that he meant it there, but that's the use I'm going to make of it here. So Lewis really is saying that Christian faith has intellectual content. Yes, it is commitment, and yes, it is our ultimate concern, but there really is intellectual content to Christian faith that can engage the best information from all fields and opposing points of view as well. Of course, our concern with my topic today is how would this Christian faith, mere Christianity, orthodoxy, classical orthodoxy, engage our cultural discussion where voices representing intelligent design, evolution in their own ways are so loud and influential? How would Lewis help us think about what's going on? So what I'd like to do today is really cover this material in about 3 parts. Lewis on intelligent design, Lewis on evolution, and Lewis's Trinitarian vision of reality. You remember that in the first part of the 20th century, the creation science movement began, largely based on a literal interpretation of Genesis, concluding from that the world must be 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Am I not turned on? Okay. Do I just need to speak into this? I knew that. Okay. So should I go back to the beginning? My wallet's back there.
Yeah. You're gonna have to come up here. I'm sorry.
I can stay with this and just
I think they want you.
take it off. Really? Okay.
They could. Try to. Sorry, Mike.
That's okay. I told the planning committee they gave me the worst time of day, 2:45, when people's biorhythms are low, but they must have done it because this session was about the most interesting person. And I waited for some response. They said, "Oh, you mean Lewis?" Okay. Where's my wallet? But the creation science movement, of course, early in the 20th century, how you like that for transition, tended to be biblically literalistic, young earth, fixity of species, these kinds of things, and it led to the Creation Research Institute in California, so on. I think the evolution of that, of course, is near Cincinnati now with the Creation Museum. But so here you go. We also now have maybe another evolutionary step, another set of voices out there, intelligent design. I don't really care to go back to the creation science discussion, which is kind of old and I think not really as hot a topic among evangelicals these days as the intelligent design movement is. Because it seems to offer new life to ideas that there's a hot new scientific proof for the existence of God, new scientific evidence. So I want to talk about what Lewis would say about that. First of all, I think we need to figure out what evolution is. This is the briefest definition I could come up with for our purposes. So I do in 3 lines what it took 13.7 billion years to accomplish. The universe began, cosmic evolution tells us that the universe began 13.7 billion years ago, and through many stages, violent stages often, developed all of the chemical elements, all of the planets, and so forth, all of the galaxies. That's the broad stroke. Biological evolution in science tells us that life originated and developed through many forms and species, and human beings are on one branch of the tree of life with common genetic ties to chimps and other primates. This is the best condensation I can make of what science is telling us, and all the sciences converge from cosmology, astronomy, geology, biology, and tell this story, which can be told in thousands of pages, and I've condensed it to 6 lines. Now, Lewis, of course, stands in the long tradition of what we call natural theology in the Christian world. That is, giving reasons for the existence of God or an ultimate being that are not based on special revelation. And here are just some of the very typical arguments from the whole history, roughly 700-year history since St. Thomas, of reasons from natural theology. That the universe had to have a cause, and God is the first cause of the universe. That God is the source of moral law. Excuse me. That God is the source of order, or the cause of order in the universe. Or more recently, what we call the Anthropic Argument, the fine-tuning argument, arguments of that nature, go something like this at the bottom here. God is the most probable reason why all the highly improbable conditions necessary for life would actually occur and yield human life. So Lewis understands this tradition. I added the 4th item there, but Lewis understands this tradition. And he appreciates it, and in many ways he reflects it. Although he reflects it, it's kind of in the background in various ways in his writings. I think this would be a better statement, summary, of probably 3 of his most favorite arguments. That awareness of moral law, that he really, all things considered, he really relies heavily on the awareness of moral law being best explained by a higher rational and moral source. He also has the argument from reason that human rational thought, in order to be free to look at logic and evidence, rather than be determined materialistically, so to speak, that is best explained by something outside of nature as its source that planted it in nature, and this something is more like a mind than anything else. And of course, one we can't pursue here, the argument from desire, and that is that there's a deep human longing that cannot be satisfied by finite things, and only the infinite can satisfy. But really, even none of these are really design arguments. None of them. I'm fighting up here between whether my text in front of me is driving what I'm saying or that. I think I'm going to kind of abandon the text. It's not working. Okay, so nothing really that Lewis is promoting is anything like a design argument, although clearly implicit in a lot of his arguments is that whatever this ultimate being is, it surely is intelligent, right? But they're not design arguments. So I think the question before us as we embark on what Lewis might tell us about evolution and intelligent design, we have to say, in what exact sense then are we talking about God being a designer? And of course, what sorts of considerations, if any, legitimately point to a designer, are really truly relevant to talking of some ultimate designer? And of course, I think there are two ways of answering such questions. There's the traditional answer of natural theology, which we had a peek at a minute ago. And then there's the ID answer. One noteworthy, newsworthy event that occurred in '04, about late '04, I think, hit the New York Times and other major news sources, was the conversion of longtime atheist, probably one of the most famous atheists in our lifetime, Antony Flew. And a lot of people think he was converted largely because of a design argument. But while that's sort of true, if you read the book, it's sort of true, but it's a traditional answer to the design argument. What gave the world its order? And why is the world accessible to mind? And he thinks the answer to that is a traditional answer. There must be something like an ultimate mind. And so he says he's willing to become something like a deist. So he's not an atheist any longer, something like a deist. He let N.T. Wright write the last chapter, saying, if I ever take another step, it'll be toward classical Trinitarian theism. But I'm not there yet. But I'm going to let Tom Wright write the chapter to say where I might consider going. So the traditional approaches they're classical. They're of always enduring worth and relevance in the discussion. Of course, then there's the ID approach. Fairly new, 10, 11, 12 years on the horizon. Bill Demske, his first book on this, Intelligent Design, was published in '99, I believe. And he rejects natural theology, which argues philosophically that God is a designer. Instead, he claims to be scientific. This is what I meant a while ago about looking for a hot new scientific proof for the existence of God. So Bill says this in the book, God's design is accessible to scientific inquiry. Science is relevant to the question of whether there's a God. And particularly, he's not interested in all the sciences in general, but particularly interested in biochemistry. Now, just to make distinctions, a lot of what I'm going to do today is try to make definitions and distinctions to help us just sort through what could otherwise seem like a confusing maze. Mainstream biology, and Demske will even say something close to this, which he's rejecting, mainstream biology operates on the evolutionary assumption that complex life forms develop gradually from simpler forms over long periods of time through natural selection, winnowing away through genetic variations that happen by chance. Something like that is a fairly decent representation. But ID biology, they reject this approach. ID biology says that, oh no, there are instances in the biological realm, there are instances of irreducible complexity. That is Mike Behe's term from Darwin's Black Box. And Bill picks it up. But there are instances of irreducible complexity in biological forms, and that complexity can only be explained by an intelligence above nature. Now, just to define irreducible complexity, it is complexity that involves the combination of component parts which themselves have complex function and structure, such that it's highly unlikely that those component parts already functioning would have come together to make even a more complex organism. That's the gist of what's going on here. Here's the favorite example, I think, even though the blood clotting mechanism, the eye, I could think of some other examples that just fill the ID literature. One of the favorite examples is the tail of the flagellum, this little whip-like structure that's attached to some bacteria. And if you break it down in kind of an engineering drawing, you could get a little, there's no way you can read the little detail here, but the point is, it's so highly complex, and it's made up of many parts, each one of which, if you look at it independently, has its own function. But somehow all these functioning parts came together to make a more complicated function. And that seems like there's no way that chance, over long periods of time, could have brought this about. It seems irreducibly complex, something evolution could not have produced. So that's one of the many case in point that he uses. So the irreducible complexity of biochemical systems counts powerfully, he says, against the Darwinian mechanism and indeed against any naturalistic evolutionary mechanism proposed to date. And one thing you'll see in a lot of the ID literature, I have to admit, I probably shouldn't have thought of a poker example in the midst of a lot of ministers, but I couldn't think of a better example of how they use probability arguments, statistical arguments. So I made this example up to preface one of their arguments. For example, the probability of being dealt a royal flush, and I'm sure none of you being ministers know what that is. On one hand is 0.000002. Okay, pure math. The probability of being dealt a royal flush 2 hands in a row would be that number squared. And I'm not going to go through all those zeros. But it's a decimal point followed by a lot of zeros. And this is the way they argue that you find an irreducibly complex structure and you pick out some parts, you number them, you begin the multiplication process, slap in the exponents, like I just merely squared this one, and pretty soon you get a probability value that is so staggeringly small that surely evolutionary mechanisms could not have brought this item about. That's the argument strategy, and that's the Peterson example. Here would be Mike Behe, for example, using an example. He does like to refer to the blood clotting mechanism, and again, I'm not a biologist, but I read this stuff and kind of pick out a representative argument that he's making. Animals with blood clotting, he says, have about 10,000 genes, and each gene has about 3 pieces. That's 30,000 gene pieces. And TPA, or tissue plasminogen activator, has 4 domains. Okay, now he's got the math set up, ready to run it. So therefore, given that information, look at the last line, odds of the right 4 pieces coming together, then, he calculates, for blood clotting is 1 in 30,000 to the 4th power. That's 30,000 times itself, 4 times. Which, by the way, I did the math on that. It's 810 quadrillion. And this was the least favorite part of the preparation for this talk that I did. Playing Texas Hold'em with my sons was fun. That gave me the idea. But you see what's going on here. Okay. Now, of course, what you have here with this kind of approach, it's rejecting mainstream biology. It's offering a kind of an alternative that in explaining things in biology, we should be open to the possibility of a transcendent mind implanting certain items in the biological realm. The tail of the flagellum, the blood clotting mechanism, etc. Any item that looks to them irreducibly complex would be a candidate. And of course, they don't get what they consider a good hearing within mainstream biology, which says, hey, we're just looking for natural causes for natural phenomena. We're not even asking the other question. So they style themselves as not able to get a fair hearing, and I won't go into that in a lot of detail, but this film came out, what, a couple years ago? And sort of tells that story. I have friends who were interviewed, and they're very unhappy about how they were cut. But I won't go into that. So Ben Stein has taken up the cause of saying at least they need a hearing. Lacking a good hearing, the Discovery Institute was started out in Seattle a few years ago, and the idea is that a new research approach should be developed, and that is an approach that wants to include the possibility of intelligent design as a scientific explanation, as opposed to mainstream biology, which would not include that and not consider that. Well, enough of that. I really am much more interested in how Lewis would think about all these kinds of things. And first of all, just to see what we're dealing with, I think we have to admit that ID claims to be an alternative way of doing science, employing transcendent intelligence, as we said. Instead of blind natural forces, what would Lewis say? Although Lewis was a classicist and a literary figure, he certainly appreciated the integrity of the methods of all fields of knowledge. And there's almost nothing he didn't know something about. And he knew something about science. It comes out particularly in the Space Trilogy, you know, what he knew about science and so on. But it seems to me that it's pretty clear with Lewis, he accepts mainstream science and the integrity of its approach, seeking natural explanations for natural phenomena. Now, in the literature these days, this has been called methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism. And I'm afraid a lot of people see that as somehow haunting or sinister that naturalism is in the title. But in other words, proceeding as if the question of more ultimate realities is just not on the table, neither yea nor nay. And Lewis, in many ways, tells us that science deals with quantitative and empirical matters, but not with qualitative matters, values, metaphysical matters like the nature of the mind or free will, and much less whether there's a transcendent intelligence. Let's let him speak for himself. Science works by experiments. Let me ask, Greg, how do I turn on the little laser light? In the middle?
We don't have it.
Oh, you don't have it? Oh, the top one. Aha, got it. Whoa, don't point that in your eye. Okay. I told you this was my first. Yeah. Science works by experiments. It watches how things behave. Every scientific statement in the long run is just a factual statement, like I pointed the telescope into the sky and I saw such and such. This is the job of science. But why anything comes to be there at all, and whether there's anything behind the things science observes, something of a different kind, this is not a scientific question. If there is something behind, then either it will have to remain altogether unknown to men or else make itself known in some different way besides science. Continued. The statement that there is any such thing and the statement that there's no such thing are neither of them statements that science can deal with. And real scientists do not usually make them while they're doing science, as science, within their methodological framework. Of course, I've said this many times, and I'll continue to defend this thesis, scientists are persons too. And so as persons, they will have ultimate questions, but within the framework of their science, this is not something they deal with. After all, supposing science ever became so complete that it knew every single thing in the whole universe, is it not plain that the questions, why is there a universe? Why does it go on as it does? Has it any meaning? Those questions would remain as they were, untouched. So we've come to a crucial distinction, it seems to me, between methodological naturalism on the one hand and philosophical naturalism on the other hand. I'm feeling more empowered that I've got this little red thing. I'm doing better? Okay. Methodological naturalism again, seeking natural causes from natural phenomena. But now, what is it that worries people about naturalism is, I think, the baggage it carries of being philosophical naturalism, which is a worldview. It's a view of ultimate reality. It's got a lot of commitments about what ultimate reality is. It's the view that nature alone, physical stuff alone, is real, that there's no supernatural, that humanity is nothing but a complex animal, that there are no objective values, that everything that happens is at the most basic level a result of chance without meaning or purpose. It's loaded like that. So when you see methodological naturalism as kind of like what science is committed to, the fear is, isn't there philosophical naturalism connected to that? So I think that's a helpful distinction. Moving on to further develop Lewis's response to ID. Remember, what we really have said so far is that ID triggers on what it sees as deficiency. Whoops, I hit the wrong, there you go. Too empowered. Triggers on deficiencies or incompletions or gaps in science. And I had lunch in Philly at a science conference with Bill Demske, I think it was June of '99, and the book had just come out, Intelligent Design. So we had lunch, and I said, Bill, you're creating a God of the gaps argument that is reminiscent of what happened in the European Enlightenment, you know, in the 17th and 18th centuries. And Bill is a little bit, I don't know, kind of feeling like nobody listens to him. And here I was saying that, so it didn't go well. And basically, what I was trying to say to him is that in the Enlightenment period, God had to retreat from nature as science advanced and found natural explanations where once God explanations were proposed. I mean, even Newton, who had on paper a very precise calculation of how the planets should move, realized that after you lifted your eyes from the paper and looked at the telescope, there were slight variations from his calculations. So what did he do? He proposed that God would step in periodically and adjust their orbits. So there's a gap in his science on paper. Who filled the gap? God. As a scientific explanation, so that as science progressed and closed that gap with a natural explanation, a better explanation in natural terms, God had to retreat from nature, which means that deism looms large as the result, and once you've got God out of nature with a deistic position, you're on your way to naturalism, and Western culture certainly went that way. But ID arguments down here regarding the irreducible complexity of the flagellum, the eye, and so on are undercut by existing science now, as well as new scientific discoveries, meaning they look to me like they really are committing that old fallacy of wanting to make God a competitive hypothesis within the realm of science. One of the dangers, I think, is that educated people, particularly scientists, now they'll wonder about the intellectual credibility of the underlying faith that seems to motivate such really bad arguments. So I think, to sum up where we are so far, Lewis's dual response is something like this. We need to respect the methodologies of all fields of knowledge, including science, and we've kind of covered that idea with Lewis, I think, contrasting him with ID. Matters of meaning and value and so on are matters of theology, metaphysics, and philosophy, not science itself. That's the previous point we made. Here I thought I'd take a point of personal privilege and just show you some pictures on our family vacation. Because I've never done this kind of thing before, and I thought maybe a brief interlude in the middle. of all this tech. But years ago, on a family trip, Aaron was 12, Adam was 6, and we passed a very flashy billboard alongside the highway while I was driving. And you keep conversation going on in the car in order to stop wrestling matches from going on in the backseat. So I said to Adam, who was 6, and he was into building things and big trucks at that stage of life, 6 years old, I said, why is that billboard alongside the road? And Adam said, well, because a high lift came in and some workers came in and they planted it in the ground and they built that thing. Great, Adam, great. Aaron, why is it there? Now he's 12. He's a little more well-versed in the ways of the world. He says because some business wanted to put it up there and draw attention to make profit. Now, they're both right. But one is within the framework of building things, and the other in the framework of intentions and choices and purposes. Explaining the same billboard, but you don't want to make them competitive. So Lewis, I think, helps us make that point as one of his criticisms of ID. I think the other thing that's so interesting in Lewis is he's not finished with his criticism of design arguments. For him, even though he did, he embraced a number of arguments from natural theology, the moral argument, the cosmological argument, so on. He believed that stand-alone, unqualified design arguments are always bad. They're always countered by the problem of suffering. It wins every time it's put against an unqualified, unattached design argument. Let's just read the problem of pain on this point. You ask me to believe that this world, is the work of a benevolent and omnipotent spirit. I reply that all the evidence points in the opposite direction. Either there is no spirit behind the universe, or else a spirit indifferent to good and evil, or else an evil spirit. Regarding the basis of religion, reasoning from this world to the goodness and wisdom, or you could read intelligence, of the Creator is just preposterous. So, standalone design arguments, he is really not a fan of. And I've told Bill Demske, others have, that it's just so glib and conveniently selective to promote ID arguments that the certain bacteria got a tail, while much in the animal kingdom suffers from predation and savagery. I think that one helpful distinction we can make as we proceed then is that Lewis believed that evolution is a true theory, highly confirmed, even in his day. Sometimes you call it hypothesis. It's a proposal about but the theory-fact distinction is a more general distinction that sometimes we don't get right. I think it helps us not, it hurts our thinking. We need to be helped in getting past this. We call something that's not a fact a theory. That would be wrong. In science, a fact is a confirmed theory. And Lewis took evolution to be confirmed, and he believed in God. He took it as a fact, a confirmed theory. He believed in God, but not according to a design argument approach. If you want to look at a few other passages in the problem of pain, both on cosmic and biological evolution, he says this: look at the universe. By far the greatest part of it consists of empty space, completely dark, and so on. Moving on a little bit further, it's improbable that any planet except Earth sustains life. Well, we could debate that. And Earth herself existed without life for millions of years and may exist for millions more when life has left her. And what is life like while it lasts? All the forms of biological life can live only by preying on one another. That's his vision. I mean, that's the functionality and health we have is we're at the tip of a pyramid based on a whole pyramid of suffering. Or we wouldn't have the functionality and health we have. And no other species would either. More from Lewis. Again, the problem of pain, and a little bit more directly on biological evolution. That man is physically descended from animals, I have no objection. For centuries, God perfected the animal form, which was become the vehicle of humanity in the image of himself. The creature may have existed for ages before it became man. This is very similar to the Catholic Church's view, actually, because he's Anglican. But at some point in the process, he's basically saying that animality and rationality became wed in one new kind of being, the human being. He has no problem saying that God willed a universe to come into existence that would eventually bring forth that kind of creature. He has no problem saying that and still believing in what he took to be a confirmed theory, a fact of evolution. And this creature can make judgments of the higher kind of truth, goodness, and beauty. Now, I think again, just to restate what we're dealing with, creation science and ID see evolution as implying atheism. So evolution in their minds becomes identified with the view that matter alone is real, all the things that naturalism is identified with. Chance and randomness eliminate design and purpose, moral absolutes do not exist, and a human being is merely a complex animal with no special dignity. But these claims are not scientific. We really are now in the territory of philosophical naturalism, which brings us to the need for making a crucial distinction between evolution as science and evolution as co-opted by philosophical naturalism. Lewis never had any objection to science or to evolution, but he was a sworn opponent of naturalism and kind of anything that it would bond with. I just watched Spider-Man 3 on TV the other day, and something was trying to bind with Spider-Man 3, his molecules, right? That little black thing and from outer space. And so naturalism can try to bind, you know what I'm saying? Okay. And that's what, so he, not only was he a sworn opponent of naturalism, he could see what it was co-opting. And he dealt with it in masterful ways in many different passages, many different works. So here's an interesting passage from Mere Christianity. Please do not think that one of these views, either naturalism or supernaturalism, was held a long time ago and that the other has gradually taken its place. Wherever there's been thinking men, both views turn up. And by using science alone, in the ordinary sense, you couldn't determine which is right. He's basically saying, number one, it's just propaganda that the Richard Dawkinses of the world are peddling, that supernaturalism is like something that was believed when people were superstitious, pre-scientific, and so on, less intellectually sophisticated. But now that science has had such amazing success, it really boosts the credibility of a naturalistic worldview, which we defined earlier. And he's also saying that science, operating by its natural methods, just can't decide on such a philosophical question. In our culture, we've probably seen a number of voices. This is one of the earlier voices who, as Carl said this morning, became a highly recognized public intellectual, Carl Sagan. In the 80s, you know, his blockbuster book, Cosmos, became a PBS series. And in the early pages of Cosmos, speaking as a scientist, I guess, he says this: the cosmos is all there is, all there ever was, and all there ever will be. He's representing naturalism in the guise of science. Of course, these days, probably Dawkins is the major spokesperson. Here's a quote from The Blind Watchmaker. An atheist before Darwin, so he wants to co-opt Darwin's achievement. An atheist before Darwin could have said, following David Hume, I have no explanation for complex biological design. All I know is that God is not a good explanation, so I have to wait and hope that somebody comes up with a better one. Then he says, so atheism, you could always be an atheist. It was logically possible, logically tenable before Darwin, but Darwin, he made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, to be intellectually fulfilled, because if we believe in principle that nature alone is real and it explains itself, that's a principle, that's a generality. But evolution can be co-opted to give us the details and the mechanics and flesh out the principle. So it can be really intellectually fulfilled. That quote, I believe, that was from the Blind Watchmaker, wasn't it? Yeah. Why the evidence of evolution reveals a universe without design. So I think what we're seeing now is that naturalism co-opts evolutionary science, forms bonds with it, passes off the whole package as scientific. And one criticism of this is that it's reductionistic. Now, reductionism in general is to reduce something to what it is not, losing some of its important dimensions. So here I think it's fair to say we're encountering scientific reductionism, where qualitative matters, metaphysical matters, personal realities are reduced to the empirical, the material, the physical, so on, the quantitative. So evolutionary naturalism has the problem of being reductionistic. Lewis sees this. He deals with it, for example, in the space trilogy, which is as wonderful as it is in all of its elements. It's not really primarily about physical, advanced space travel or technological warfare, but about the irreconcilable conflict between the Christian tradition and the evolutionary or developmental tendencies of modern thought, where naturalism has bonded with evolution, and we're no longer talking biology, we're talking something different, a secular vision of humanity and life and reality. And Lewis repeatedly insists that biology is not his target, but the perspective that twists Darwin in the agenda for progressive development of humankind. And if my memory is correct, is it in the second book of the trilogy, which is what, Out of the Silent Planet? No. It's Pearland is the second book. Is it Lord Feverstone who says and reveals, I mean, Lewis is masterful here. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, just an ad lib here, just while we're putting a little flesh on this particular bone, doesn't Lord Feverstone give a good representation of this secular vision when he says this? He says, the time is coming when humanity will have to take control of humanity. But he says it's very important to be the ones taking the control and not the ones being taken control of. For technological or political manipulation in service of some evolutionary, developmental, secular vision. Okay, now, that agenda we often label these days by the term social Darwinism, different from biological. I think, again, making distinctions, making definitions, help sort our way through the maze of voices and the maze of ideas. So Lewis is hardly bothered by the prospect of subhuman ancestry, but he's very bothered about bad philosophy. Technologically or politically, then, can justify the manipulation of human beings. Summarizing to this point, Lewis accepts evolution as science, rejects evolution as a facade for philosophical naturalism, and the corrective is Christian worldview can incorporate evolution into a comprehensive perspective that engages the latest knowledge. Lewis is a classicist, and he's a classical Christian thinker, which means he's got to be committed to the view that all truth is God's truth, wherever it's found. So if evolution is a major truth emerging from the sciences, Lewis's reaction to that would be the Christian worldview can engage that. It can engage that. The real debate then is still between theism, or really better, Christian, distinctively Christian theism, mere Christianity, Nicene, Orthodox, classical Christianity, and naturalism. That's the real debate. And both are competing, for example, to explain such important human activities as science itself. Science doesn't decide between the two, but you can partly decide between the two by seeing which one gives us a better view of what science really is, that activity, as a knowledge-gathering enterprise about a rational physical world. Lewis thinks Christian theism is a better explanation, and of why the world is accessible to mind. And of course, a similar competition then occurs with respect to the view of evolution. Naturalism, as we've seen, wants to co-opt evolution, the truths of evolution, simply as important contours and details of the physical world. Naturalism would like to have those. I think Lewis would say, there's no way we're surrendering any truth. There's no way we're surrendering any truth. Not that science can't further revise and develop and edit what it's doing, but it's highly, highly confirmed science that's worth calling a fact. So again, Lewis would recommend that we see this positive relation, that Christian theism can explain what we're finding about evolution. Maybe in general terms, maybe not in detail, but in broad strokes. Let me put a little finer point on that. I think that's at one level. There's no incompatibility. Christianity, Christian theism can explain an evolutionary world. Sort of one directional, the arrow was just one directional. Here I've got two arrows, sort of a bidirectionality, trying to suggest this, that there are deep resonances that I think Lewis sees between evolution and Christian theism. The resonance could be described something like this: the exploration of alternative possibilities within lawful structure. And that's true of the human reality as well as biological reality. There's no Christian mandate that we have to say that the creation is fixed, determined, and not open to different potential futures. And evolutionary development biologically and human development have some parallel we could explore, but I won't. And I think Lewis sees it, and I'll make that point a little bit better in a minute. They're suggesting, as I say at the bottom here, some kind of a dynamic or self-actualizing aspect to reality. This is from Miracles. I don't have a slide on this, but I want to read from Miracles. Only supernaturalists really see nature. Nature literally looms too large for the naturalist. You must go a little away from her and then turn round and look back. Then at last, the true landscape will become visible. You must have tasted, however briefly, the pure water from beyond before you can be distinctively conscious of the hot, salty tang of nature's current. To treat her as God or as everything is to lose the whole pith and pleasure of her. Come out, look back, and then you will see her. And what do we see? We see, I think, the exploration of alternative possibilities within lawful structure in a dynamic and self-actualizing way. And that certainly resonates with Christian vision, classical Christian vision of reality. Which I think takes us to this point. If there's this resonance, we're about time to try to put it all together. We're at the point where we can try to do that and say, what is Lewis's defining vision here? Where if evolution can really be a fact, a large fact that's taken up into this vision, how does that go for Lewis? First of all, I think we have to recognize Lewis's, one of his deepest commitments is that Trinitarian life The life of the Godhead itself is intrinsically self-living, owing its existence to nothing. But it's self-giving life and created everything else. And his exposition of Trinitarian themes tell us that this is a deeply, deeply relational universe, where God willed that the universe bring forth a creature where animality and rationality were wed, and that creature could be invited back into the life of the Trinity in relationship. And even the material or the physical, animality, we're people of creation and incarnation and sacrament, which affirms materiality, is involved. And Lewis brings this up at the end of Mere Christianity. The distinction then between bios, or biological life, and zoe. Remember that in Mere Christianity? He uses these terms, bios, to mean finite biological life, and zoe, of course, in Greek, to mean God's infinite, eternal, higher life of love, joy, peace, and beatitude. So he says this about the nature of God and the Trinitarian life. God is not a static thing, not even a person, but a dynamic, pulsating activity, a life, almost a kind of drama, almost, if you will not think me irreverent, a kind of dance. The whole dance or drama or pattern of this three-personal life is to be played out in each one of us. Or, putting it the other way, each one of us has got to enter that pattern, take his place in that dance. There's no other way to the happiness for which we were made. Good things as well as bad, you know, are caught by a kind of infection. If you want to get warm, you must stand near the fire. If you want to be wet, you must get into the water. If you want joy, power, peace, eternal life, you must get close to or even into the thing that has them. They're not a sort of prize which God could, if he chose, just hand out to anyone. They're a great fountain of energy and beauty spurting up at the very center of reality. If you're close to it, the spray will wet you. If not, you will remain dry. Once a man is united to God, how could he not live forever, sharing the divine life? And once separated, how could he not but wither and die? Amazing lines. The theme of the dance. I didn't have family photos, but I did have this one that I thought I need a little break from the text, dense textual material, which I'm prone to. So there's your one picture. Well, I guess we had Dawkins. Oh, we had Dawkins, and we got through. Okay. But there's the Rublev's Trinity. But Lewis, there's hardly a theme that Lewis goes back to in various writings more than the dance. He spends page after page, and it was in Paralandra, page after page on the dance. And it's a theme, but he borrows it from the 4th century writer Gregory of Nazianzus, of course, the great patriarch of the Eastern Church, who was trying to say something about the meaning of John's Gospel, chapters 14 through 17, all of the references to if I dwell in you and you dwell in me and the Father dwells in me, Jesus would say, and so forth. The mutual indwelling, the perichoretic passages, Gregory was trying to say something about, and Lewis picks up on that and weaves it right into the passage that we just read. So the Trinitarian vision, Lewis thinks, is large enough, profound enough, compelling enough to embrace whatever truth we find. And this is going to be dense with I gave you the break with the Trinity picture. Now we're going back into text. Let's read this text and meditate on it and use it as a kind of a fitting benediction to our session together. Perhaps a modern man can understand the Christian idea of transformation by participation in the divine life, the Trinitarian life. He can understand it best if he takes it in connection with evolution. My goodness, He's starting out saying that this is the last page in Mere Christianity. Everyone now knows that man has evolved from lower types of life. Consequently, people often wonder, what is the next step? When's the next thing beyond man going to appear? Some suppose a Superman will appear with extra legs or arms. Popular guesses at the next step envision men developing great brains and getting greater mastery over nature. But I cannot help but think that the next step will be really new, and I should expect the next stage not to be a stage in evolution as science studies it at all. And I should not be surprised if, when the thing happened, a very few people really noticed that it was happening. The Christian view is precisely that the next step has already appeared, and it is really new. It is not a change from brainy men into brainier men. It's a change that goes off in a totally different direction. A change from being creatures of God to being sons of God. The first instance appeared in Palestine 2,000 years ago. The first instance appeared in Palestine, in a sense, this change then is not evolution, because it's not something arising out of the natural process of events, but something coming into nature from outside. But that is what I should expect. We arrived at our idea of evolution from studying the past. If there are real novelties in store in the future, of course, our idea based on the past will not really cover them. At the earlier stages, living organisms had no choice about taking the new step. But the next step of being turned from creatures into sons is entirely voluntary. I have called Christ the first instance of the new man, but of course he's something much more than that. He is the new man who takes bios up into Zoe. At the beginning, I said there were personalities in God. This is the last section of Mere Christianity, of course. I will now go further. There are no real personalities anywhere else until you have given up yourself to Him. You will no longer have a real self. But there must be a real giving up of the self. You must throw it away, blindly, so to speak. Lord, help us to do that. Submit to death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day, and death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being, and you will find eternal life. Keep back nothing. Nothing that you have not given away will be really yours, and nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find Him, and with Him, everything else thrown in. Thus endeth the reading.